Chapter 12. We were all in bed that night, the house dark, when we were awakened by pounding at our door. The dogs that generally slept in the woodshed were by now having a loud conversation with someone outside, and we could hear him talking back to them firmly. The rain had stopped, but the night outside our door was thick with wet air, and Constable Leska looked like he wore a layer of spiderweb over his black raincoat. One or two dogs continued to question him, but they quieted down at a single word from my father, who stood in the doorway in his night things, my mother behind him tightening her robe. While I peeked around her, my brothers behind me, and Aunt Lily came marching to join us, her hair in rollers, her face angry. "And what is this all about? And what is all this about now?" she said. I imagined my grandparents sitting up in their bed, hoping they wouldn't have to join the fray. "Very sorry to wake you, John, Sarah. Hello, Lily," Constable Leska said. "I know it's late, but can I come in for a minute?" "Of course," my father said. He stepped back to let the constable by. "I wouldn't have come so late, but I'm afraid I couldn't wait until morning." The constable said, "Betty Glengarry has gone missing." "Missing?" my father said. "You'd better come on in and sit," my mother said. "I'll bet she got eaten by a bear," James said, his hair sticking out in all directions. "You boys, back to bed," my father said. "Now." When they hesitated, Aunt Lily took them in hand with a sharp word and a set mouth. "Bed," your father said. As if they were wayward sheep, she poked and prodded them out of the room. I, it seemed, would be allowed to stay. For a while, being included in these conversations had made me feel tall. Now I was ready to be 11 again, and back up in bed like my brothers. I could feel myself tightening up as before and wish that whoever was doing the tuning would have pity. None of this was fun. "Please, come on now, sit," my mother said. When the constable looked down at his mud-caked boots, water streamed from the divot in his hat. "I'm a mess, Sarah." But my mother took him by the arm and led him to a chair at the kitchen table. "You're cold right through and wet," she said as she put some supper coffee on the stove to warm. "A little mud won't matter." We all took a seat as Aunt Lily returned to the kitchen. "You two," she said to me, "back to bed. This is no talk for children." As if my parents were not sitting right there alongside me. "Leave her be, Lily," my father said. "Annabelle may know more about this than we do." The constable took off his hat and laid it on his knees. "Mrs. Taylor came to see me about the whole Belfry business," he said, smoothing his hair flat. "We talked it through. I saw where things were headed, and I had made up my mind to visit the Glengarrys in the morning, when here they came, knocking at the door." He rubbed his hands to warm them. It was dark by then. Betty hadn't come home from school, and they were worried. More so when Mrs. Taylor told them Betty had never come to school in the first place. I nodded. "We thought she must be sick." Constable Leska shook his head. "No, she left for school as always, rain or not." Her grandma dressed her for the wet, and then watched her go down the lane and disappear, headed toward Wolf Hollow, same as ever. My mother got up to pour him some coffee. "No sign at all of where she went?" "In this weather, the whole world's mud and flood." "Then what?" my father said. "If there's something you need from us—" "Toby's gone," the constable said. "First thing I did was go down to his shack to find out if he'd seen her. Not," he said suddenly, his hands up, "not to suggest he'd done anything wrong. First time I went to see him after Ruth got hurt, I found him outside the shack chopping wood. When I told him what Betty was saying about him, Toby got a look on his face, and I have to say, I didn't like it. And I wasn't happy that he had an axe in his hand at the time. But he didn't say a word or do a thing, just went back to his work." The constable shook his head. There wasn't much I could do at that point except collect pieces of the puzzle and try to keep an open mind. So when I went back there tonight, I truly meant only to learn if he'd seen Betty today. Toby covers more ground than most people, including the woods and orchards and out-of-the-way places between the Glengarry place and the schoolhouse, but he wasn't there. "How do you know he's really gone?" my mother asked. "Well, I suppose I don't, but he wasn't in the shack. No fire, cold coals, no guns, no camera, no nothing." He heaved a sigh, looked at me and away. "He had stuck pictures all over the walls," he said. "I had my searchlight in my truck, spent some time in there, looking at those pictures. I tried to pull one off, but he used pine sap and it was on there good." He took a crumpled photograph from his pocket and handed it to my father, who smoothed it out and looked at it for a moment before passing it to my mother. So you don't think it's odd that a man like Toby is sneaking around taking pictures of your daughter when she's unaware?" I moved around behind my mother and peered over her shoulder. The picture showed me walking down the path to school. Sunlight coming through the branches lit up my face, but the rest of me looked vague in the shadows. It felt strange seeing what I looked like when I thought I was alone. I had never known that Toby was there, in the trees nearby, watching. "It's odd the way Toby is odd," my mother said, "but that doesn't mean it's something worse." Aunt Lily stood up suddenly. More of his pictures came back in today's mail, she said, and hurried off to her room. When she returned, I reached out my hand. He wanted me to give them to him as soon as they came back, I said. Well, you can't very well do that when he's run off, she said, handing the package to the constable. He opened it, took the pictures out of the envelope inside, and held them well away from his wet coat as he looked at each one. His face became tougher as he did. He held one back, passing the rest to my parents, who looked at them together, Aunt Lily across the table, fidgeting impatiently. What? She said. Pass those here. Some yellow trees, my father said, a field of pumpkins. He paused and turned to the constable. But I suspect that one you've got there is something different. The constable nodded. He passed it over, and I moved behind my father so I could see it. We were looking at the schoolhouse road from high above. Some tree branches split the scene, but I could make out Mr. Ansel's grays, his wagon filled with apples, Ruth lying in the road, Mr. Ansel climbing down from his wagon, and me. Oh, my lord, my mother said quietly. But this doesn't mean anything, I said. Just because he took that picture doesn't mean he threw the rock. I'm afraid it means quite a lot, young lady, the constable said, especially since Betty is missing, and Toby's gone after she accused him of hurting Ruth, after I went down there and told him so. And you must realize that he knew we'd be looking at these very pictures at some point, all of which adds up to a worrisome conclusion. But right now the most important thing is finding Betty. That terrible man, Aunt Lily said. She should have looked harmless in her robe and rollers, but she didn't. The constable turned to me. Mrs. Taylor told me Andy was at the schoolhouse today looking for Betty. Do you know anything about that, Annabelle? I shrugged. Andy and Betty really like each other. I thought about it for a minute. They usually disappear at recess. You already know about the belfry, and I think she and Andy sharpened up a wire and strung it across the path. It cut my little brother across the forehead. I traced a line across my own. The constable shook his head. Another story I need to hear. But right now, I'm going to talk to Andy. Depending on what he has to say, we'll round up some people and go looking. I hope you can help with that, John. And what about Toby? Aunt Lily demanded. I certainly don't like the idea of a crazy man running loose around here. She tightened her robe across her chest. I suspect he's long gone, the constable said, probably miles from here by now. But I'll let the state barracks know the situation in case he shows up somewhere else. He climbed to his feet. In the meantime, finding Betty should be our only purpose. He gave Aunt Lily a stern look. Nothing else. She lifted her chin. And when she's found, I promise I'll look into this, he said, tucking the picture in his pocket, but leave it to me now. He turned back to my father. Are those dogs of yours any good at tracking? Not much unless there's a meatloaf on the run, my father said. Well, you might want to take them along just in case. But first, Andy, let me hear what he's got to say.